Bernadette Halloran slid the 3-page document across the kitchen table at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, before Adeline had even sat down. "Sign it," she said, cradling a cup of coffee in a house that wasn't hers, smiling a smile that never reached her eyes. "It just clarifies your position." Her position. Adeline read all 3 pages, slowly, line by line, the kind of language written specifically so that no one understands it the first time through. Reduced to its essential meaning, it said this: she surrendered any claim to anything bearing her husband's name, in exchange for acceptance from a circle of women who had finished deciding about her on the day of the wedding. For the 2 years before that, Adeline Vance had sat at a desk outside the office of the most powerful man in South Philadelphia, making coffee for people who walked past her the way they walked past a printer. Bernadette had passed that desk dozens of times, and had never once asked her name. No one in that world ever had, and every one of them believed her silence was a sign of weakness. Adeline set the paper down. She looked Bernadette directly in the eye. Then she did the thing nobody saw coming. She smiled back and asked her if she wanted more coffee. 4 weeks later, in a stone house in the Pocono Mountains, at 2:51 in the morning, the power went out, the phone signal vanished, and 3 armed men walked in looking for her. They had been hired to do a very specific job. Not one of them had ever met her father. If you have ever been underestimated simply because you don't raise your voice, this story is for you. Leave a like if you believe a person's worth has nothing to do with the title they carry. Share this with someone who has quietly carried more than their share and never once complained. And subscribe to walk with me all the way to the end of Adeline Vance's story, because what she sets down on that table in the final chapter turns out to be far more dangerous than any weapon in the room. 2 years before that Saturday morning, Adeline Vance was already on the 3rd floor of the Rourke Freight and Storage Building at 7:45. 15 minutes earlier than the time written in her employment contract, and she had done the same thing every day since her very first week. She hung her coat on the hook behind her chair. She turned on the coffee maker and waited for it to finish the first cycle before pouring that batch away, because the first water always tasted bitter. She opened the appointment book. At 8:15, someone from the Marine Insurance Company was due. At 8:50, there was a representative from the Port Authority. At 10:30, there was a name written only as initials, a name she wasn't permitted to ask about. Emmett Rourke needed exactly 7 minutes between meetings. Not 5, not 10, 7. During those 7 minutes, he stood with his back to the door, looking down at the harbor, and no one was allowed to knock. Adeline learned that in her 2nd month, and she'd never needed to learn it again. She printed bills of lading, sorted them into 3 stacks according to destination port, and clipped yellow notes to the pages with weight discrepancies. She received the mail, signed for it on his behalf, and put it away in the drawer. And every time the elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor, she pulled the leather-bound notebook lying to the right of her keyboard toward her and wrote 1 line by hand. Who came? What time? How long they stayed? Who came with them? She didn't do it because anyone had asked her to. The company had a computerized system that recorded everyone entering and leaving, and twice that system had somehow lost an entire week's worth of data without anyone ever explaining why. Her father had once told her that a notebook never broke down, never updated itself, and could never be altered by someone else without you knowing. So she wrote things down, in ink. When she filled 1 notebook, she took it home at the end of the month, put it in the bottom drawer of her cabinet, and began another. No one ever asked what she was writing. People walked past that desk for 8 hours every day, men in heavy coats and women in high heels, and they spoke to one another right over her head about sums of money larger than the apartment she was renting, and they left paper cups on her desk the way people left trash on a table that belonged to no one. Once, a man told her to bring more sugar without even looking up. She brought the sugar. She said nothing. At exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Adeline turned off her monitor, locked the drawer, put on her coat, and walked 8 minutes to the bus stop on the corner. She boarded the westbound route, got off at the stop 1 block from the hospital, and walked through the automatic glass doors at 5:40. Weldon Vance was in room 409, on the 4th floor, in the respiratory unit. He was 63 years old. He had spent 22 years on a mountain search and rescue team, going into the places everyone else was running out of. And the thing that finally brought him down wasn't a cliff or an avalanche, but the air he'd breathed for all those 22 years. She sat in the chair to the right of his bed and told him about the small things that had happened during her day, and he listened, and every now and then he asked a question that showed he was still following every word. Her mother had died of illness when Adeline was very young, and after that, there had only been 3 people left in the house, then 2, then only her. walking 8 minutes to the bus stop every evening. On the small table beside her father's bed, there was always a stack of envelopes she didn't open at the hospital. She took them home and opened them at night, and the numbers inside grew larger with every passing month, slowly and steadily, like a rising tide. The man who had once promised to marry her had seen the first bill, had gone silent for 3 days, then told her he needed time to think. He thought, and he never came back. Adeline didn't tell anyone at work about that, because there was no one at work to tell. She simply began arriving 15 minutes earlier. She worked there for 2 years, 730 days, and she didn't miss a single one. Not even the day her fever climbed so high that she had to hold on to the side of the elevator. Not even the day the doctor called at 6 o'clock in the morning to tell her that her father's lungs had worsened by another stage. She was still there at 7:45. She still poured away the first batch of coffee, and she still pulled the leather-bound notebook toward her every time the elevator doors opened, writing down one name, one time, and a second name beside the first, with no idea at all that one day those handwritten lines would be worth more than everything ever said in the room behind her. On Tuesday afternoon, at 2:15, Gareth Poole stepped out of the elevator 11 minutes ahead of his scheduled appointment and stopped beside Adeline's desk because the inner office door was still closed. He was 41 years old, the company's chief accountant, and over the course of 2 years he had passed that desk often enough that he no longer saw it at all. Adeline pulled the notebook toward her and wrote the 4th entry of the day. Gareth Poole, 2:15, alone. Then she turned back to the bill of lading spreadsheet open on her screen. Poole's phone vibrated inside his jacket pocket. He took it out, glanced at the screen, and answered it right there, less than an arm's length from her elbow, with the ease of a man standing in an empty room. He said that every account under the name Meridian Bay Holdings had to be moved before Thursday. He said that once the contract for Pier 9 was signed, the flow of money would be locked into notarized records, and after that no one would be able to pull it back out. He listened to the person on the other end for a while, then gave a quiet laugh through his nose. He said there was no need to worry, that the whole thing worked for one very simple reason. He trusts me, Poole said. He never looks closely at anything he thinks he doesn't need to look at. Then he told the person on the other end not to call this number again, and hung up. Adeline was still typing. She didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't change her rhythm. Her 2 index fingers kept moving across the keyboard at exactly the same speed they had for the previous 3 minutes, because one of the first things her father had ever taught her, back when she was too young to understand why he was teaching a child things like this, was that when someone heard something they weren't supposed to hear, what killed them wasn't what they heard. It was the way their body reacted to it. Don't look up. Don't hold your breath. Don't do anything you weren't doing 1 second ago. So she finished the line she was typing, then typed the next one, and by the time Poole walked into the conference room, she had completed 2 more bills of lading. Inside her mind, a very calm voice was repeating the 3 words she'd just heard. He trusts me. Weldon Vance had once sat across from his daughter at their small dining table, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, and told her that there was one sentence in the English language more dangerous than any threat, and it didn't sound like a threat at all. That sentence was, "He trusts me." He told her to pay attention to the way people said it. If it was spoken with gratitude, it was a debt. If it was spoken with relief, it was a burden. But if it was spoken with satisfaction, the kind of satisfaction a person felt after discovering an unlocked door, then what she was hearing was someone describing their weapon. And people only described their weapons when they'd already decided they were going to use them. Adeline had been 14 when she heard that, and she hadn't understood why her father thought she would ever need it. She was 27 when she heard Gareth Poole say those 3 words beside her elbow, and she realized that he'd been right. He'd simply been right 13 years too early. She pulled the notebook toward her. She wrote down the time Poole entered the room, 2:22. She didn't write anything else, because that notebook was a visitor log, not a diary, and because an unusual line in a notebook filled with ordinary ones was the first thing that caught the eye of anyone who opened it. She closed the notebook and returned it to exactly where it had been, a little over an inch from the edge of the keyboard, exactly as it had rested there every day for 730 days. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When the door opened, Poole came out with 2 other men, halfway through a story about a golf course, and he passed Adeline's desk for the 2nd time that day. He didn't look down. It never even occurred to him that he should, because to him, that space contained only a printer, a potted plant, and something that had always been there to produce coffee whenever it was needed. Adeline watched the back of his jacket until the elevator doors closed. Then she turned back to her screen. At 4:58, she printed the last stack of bills of lading. At 5 o'clock, She turned off the monitor, but she didn't put on her coat. She stayed seated at her desk with the monitor dark, and a cup of coffee poured from the last batch, coffee that had gone so cold it no longer smelled like anything. And she did the calculation. She did it seriously, the same way she checked weights against bills of lading, one number at a time, refusing to skip any of them simply because they were unpleasant. If she spoke up, the first thing that would happen was that people would ask why she had heard it. The second was that they would remember she'd been sitting there for 2 years and start wondering how many other things she'd heard. The third was that someone else would be sitting at this desk within a week. And if someone else sat at this desk, the insurance tied to her employment contract would go with that person, and the bed in room 409 on the 4th floor of the respiratory unit would become an expense she couldn't afford in any month for the rest of her life. She had seen families forced to take their loved ones home. She had passed them in the 4th floor hallway. She knew exactly what that decision looked like on a person's face. But if she stayed silent, nothing would happen at all. That was the most frightening part of the calculation. Nothing would happen at all. Tomorrow she would still arrive at 7:45, still pour away the first batch of coffee, still write visitors' names in the leather-bound notebook, and whatever was being arranged in the dark would continue to be arranged without needing anything from her. She had been quiet all her life, and silence had never hurt her. It was what had carried her through the years after her mother died, through the night someone called with the news about Micah, through the 3 days that other man said nothing before disappearing. Silence was the only thing she owned that no one could take away. Adeline sat there with the cold coffee and realized that was exactly the problem. At 6:40, she stood up. Only half the lights were still on in the 3rd floor hallway. She walked the 11 steps from her desk to the door she had only ever knocked on in 2 years when there was an appointment. And she knocked twice, no more. There was a pause. Then his voice told her to come in. Emmett Rourke was standing with his back to the door, looking down at the harbor, a glass of filtered water in his hand. He didn't turn around immediately. He was 34 years old, and by 34 he'd learned that people revealed the most about themselves in the time they spent waiting for him to turn around. Adeline waited. She didn't clear her throat, didn't apologize for disturbing him, didn't begin with some sentence meant to soften what she was about to say. When he turned around, she told him that at 2:15 that afternoon, Mr. Poole had been standing beside her desk and had taken a phone call. Then she repeated it. She repeated it word for word, in the exact order she'd heard it, adding nothing, leaving nothing out, explaining nothing about what any of it might mean. Every account under the name Meridian Bay Holdings moved before Thursday, before the contract for Pier 9 was signed, because after that the flow of money would be locked into notarized records. And she repeated the 3 words he'd said, along with the way he'd laughed softly through his nose before saying them. She stopped. She didn't add anything like, "I thought you should know," or "I'm not sure," or "maybe it's nothing." Her father had taught her how to report an incident before she was even old enough to have a job, and the first rule was that the person listening needed facts, not the opinion of the person telling them. Emmett Rourke set the glass of water down on the desk. He looked at her for a long time, and that look was unlike any she'd ever received in this building, because for the first time, someone in this room was actually looking at her instead of looking through her. He asked why she had told him. She said it was because of the way Poole had spoken those 3 words. It sounded like a weapon. He asked how long she'd worked there. She said, 2 years, sir. And in the 4 seconds of silence that followed, Adeline understood something she would think about many times in the years to come, that this man, who knew exactly how many containers were sitting at every pier in the Delaware port, had never known that the woman who made his coffee every morning had been sitting outside that door for 730 days. He said, "Thank you, Adeline. Go home." It was the first time he'd ever called her by her name. On Wednesday morning, Gareth Poole didn't come in. Thursday morning was the same. By Friday, Human Resources sent down the new quarterly cost allocation sheet, and his name was no longer listed under the finance department. There was no announcement email, no farewell gathering, no cardboard box carried out through the elevator. His name simply disappeared from one column of a spreadsheet, and everyone kept working as though that column had always been one line shorter. Adeline didn't ask. She arrived at 7:45. She poured away the first batch of coffee. She arranged the schedule, printed bills of lading, clipped yellow notes to the pages with weight discrepancies, and every time the elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor, she pulled the leather-bound notebook toward her and wrote a line. For many weeks afterward, nothing changed on the 3rd floor except one very small thing that only she noticed. Emmett Rourke began saying thank you when she set his coffee down. Not every time, but often enough that it couldn't be an accident anymore. 6 weeks after that Tuesday afternoon, on a Monday morning, The inner office door opened at 9:10, and he called her inside. He wasn't sitting behind his desk. He was standing with one hand resting on the back of a chair, and he asked her a question she hadn't prepared for. He asked whether, in her notebook, she had recorded the times Mr. Poole came to see Mr. Halloran. Adeline was silent for half a second. In that half second, she understood that he knew about the notebook, that he'd known about it longer than she'd realized, and that he'd waited 6 weeks before asking. She said she had. She went back to her desk, opened the drawer, and brought it. She opened them and began to read. March 4th, 6:52 in the evening. Mr. Poole came up with Mr. Halloran, and they went down at 8:11. April 19th, 7:20 in the evening. Both men came up together, and they went down at 9:05. June 2nd, 6:45 in the evening. Mr. Halloran came up 12 minutes earlier. Mr. Poole came afterward, and both went down at 8:30. She finished reading and closed the notebook. All 3 visits had taken place after business hours. None of the 3 had appeared on the schedule she maintained. Emmett Rourke said nothing. He stood there with one hand still resting on the back of the chair, looking out the window toward the harbor, and he remained silent long enough for Adeline to hear the printer in the hallway finish an entire page. She waited. She didn't ask what he was thinking. At last he turned back and told her to keep doing exactly what she'd always done, and that she didn't need to tell anyone about this. He didn't say what he intended to do with the numbers she'd just given him. He didn't say whether they surprised him. Adeline carried the 3 notebooks back out, and on the way to her desk, she realized that her hands were slightly cold, even though her voice had sounded completely normal. 3 days later, on Thursday afternoon, Hollis Duke stepped out of the elevator. He was 58 years old, had stood beside the Rourke family longer than anyone else still alive, and in 2 years, he had been the only person in the building who always nodded to her when he passed. This time, he didn't pass by. He stopped, placed a cream-colored envelope on her desk, and remained standing there until she understood that he was going to wait for her to open it. Inside was a plain white card with no printed name, no logo, nothing except one handwritten line in black ink and a string of numbers beneath it. The line read, "I owe you. Tell me what you need." Adeline looked at it longer than it should have taken to read the 9 words. Then she folded the card, thanked Hollis, and placed it in the drawer on the right, the one with the lock, the one where she kept the notebook. She didn't call that day. She didn't call the next day either. The next 11 days were 11 days in which Adeline did everything a person could do when they still believed there might be one more door they hadn't knocked on. She submitted an application for treatment assistance available to former rescue workers and received a letter saying the program had closed the previous year. She called the hospital's social services department and was given an appointment 7 weeks away. She asked the bank about an unsecured loan, and the person across from her looked at her income statement, then looked at the amount she needed, and both of them understood the answer before anyone said it aloud. On the 11th night, she sat at the dining table in her small apartment with the stack of opened envelopes spread before her, and she realized that she'd reached every door there was to reach, and not one of them had opened. The next morning, she unlocked the drawer. The night before, the hospital called at 11:20 to tell her that Weldon Vance had been placed on assisted breathing for the 3rd time in 4 months, and the doctor used a phrase Adeline had heard often enough to understand exactly what it meant when it was spoken in that particular tone. The next morning, she unlocked the drawer, took out the card, and dialed the number. It rang twice. She said she needed help with something, if that was what the words on the card had meant. Emmett Rourke's voice on the other end was exactly the same as it was in the room with the windows overlooking the harbor. No faster, no slower. "That's what the words meant," he replied. "Come to dinner." She was about to say that dinner wasn't necessary, that this could be handled with a few sentences over the phone, but the word dinner hadn't been spoken as a question, and she heard herself asking when. The restaurant he chose was the kind of restaurant Adeline had only ever entered in someone else's capacity. They sat there for 2 hours. He asked where she'd grown up, and she said Montana, in a town with exactly 1 gas station and a mountain rescue team her father had served on for 22 years, and she told him that her mother had died of illness when she was still young. He asked whether she had any brothers or sisters, and she said she'd once had a brother named Micah, that he'd died at 24 while driving home, and she said it in exactly the same voice she used when reading out bill of lading numbers, because that was the only way she could say it without breaking. He didn't tell her he was sorry. He only nodded once, and she was grateful to him for that. He asked why she had stayed in Philadelphia when she could have taken her father back to Montana, and she said, because the respiratory unit here was better than anything within roughly 500 miles of that little town with one gas station, and because her father had spent his entire life going into places other people were running out of, so she couldn't see any reason to take him somewhere worse, simply because it was closer to where he'd been born. Emmett Rourke set down his glass of water. He said she wasn't what he'd expected. She asked what he'd expected. He said he'd thought she would want something bigger. Adeline genuinely thought about that, not because she was trying to give him a clever answer. She said the things she wanted weren't small at all. They just weren't glamorous. He looked at her for a moment, then said, "No, they aren't glamorous." He took care of the hospital bills within 4 days. There was no ceremony. Nothing more was said, and no one handed her a piece of paper to sign. One afternoon, the billing clerk on the first floor stopped her and said that the account for room 409 had been moved into fully paid status, and she said it with the expression of someone who had just watched a number disappear from her screen without understanding why. Adeline thanked her, took the stairs to the 4th floor, sat down in the chair to the right of the bed, and told her father nothing. For the next 3 months, she continued sitting at the desk outside the door. She still arrived at 7:45, still poured away the first batch of coffee, still wrote in the notebook every time the elevator opened. But something had changed, and it had changed in a way she couldn't control. Now he saw her. He saw her on the day he was meeting with a business partner from Baltimore and couldn't remember the name of the man's deputy. And she set down his cup of coffee and quietly spoke a name as she passed, the same name that had been written in her notebook 11 months earlier. He saw her on the day she carried in a set of signed contracts and placed one finger on the date beneath a signature, saying that this man had written the 9th, but he'd come to the 3rd floor at 4 in the afternoon on the 10th, and that was the only time he'd been there all month. So either he'd written the wrong date, or he'd signed it somewhere else. And he saw her most clearly on the day someone scheduled him for 3 consecutive meetings in 3 different locations within a span of time that made it impossible to reach all of them, and she carried the schedule over to him and said that it hadn't been arranged incorrectly. It had been arranged so that he would be forced to cancel one of the 3, and she thought he should choose which one to cancel himself, instead of letting the person who made the schedule choose for him. At the end of the 3rd month, on a January evening, he told her there was something he wanted to ask her, and that he was going to say it plainly, because he didn't know how to say it any other way. He said he needed someone outside the structure of this family whom he could trust, and in that entire building, she was the only person who didn't owe anyone a favor, didn't carry anyone's family name, and hadn't been brought in by anyone. Then he stopped, and he added one more sentence, and he said it only once. He said he wanted her to be there when he came home. Adeline didn't answer him that night. She said she needed time to think, and he told her to think. And he didn't ask how long, didn't bring it up again, didn't call her once during the next 4 days, something she would later realize was the clearest answer he'd ever given her about the kind of man he was. During those 4 days, she still went to work. She still arrived at 7:45, and still wrote in the notebook every time the elevator doors opened, and she let that question sit quietly in her mind, like a bill of lading with a weight discrepancy, something she knew she wasn't allowed to sign until she understood exactly which number was wrong and where it had gone wrong. On Friday afternoon, she took the stairs to the 4th floor and sat down in the chair to the right of the bed, in room 409. Weldon Vance had come off assisted breathing 3 days earlier. He was 63 years old, and looked 10 years older than that, but his eyes still did what they'd done throughout 22 years on the rescue team, which was to look at a situation and measure it before saying anything about it. Adeline told him everything from the beginning. She told him about Tuesday afternoon and the 3 words she'd heard beside her elbow. She told him about the 3 hours she'd spent sitting with a cup of cold coffee, about the 11 steps from her desk to that door, about the notebook and the 3 dates and times she'd read aloud. She told him about the envelope and the 11 days she'd spent knocking on every legitimate door she could find, only to have none of them open. She told him about the hospital bill that had disappeared from the billing clerk's screen on the 1st floor. And she made it clear that this was exactly why she'd hesitated, because she didn't want any decision she made to be bought by the bed he was lying in. Then she told him about that January evening and the 2 sentences the man had said to her. She told him everything. She didn't hide who he was or what that building really was, because her father had taught her how to report an incident before she was old enough to work, and the first rule was that the person listening needed the facts, not a version of the facts made easier to hear. Weldon Vance listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt her once. When she finished, he was silent for a while, and in that silence Adeline heard the heart monitor to the left of the bed continue steadily through 9 beats. Then he asked his first question. He asked, "Is he honest with you?" she said. From everything I've seen, yes. He asked his second question. He asked, does he look down on you? Adeline opened her mouth to answer and then stopped, because she'd just realized something. She was 27 years old. She'd been working since she was 18. She had served food, stood behind counters, sat at a desk outside a door for 730 days. And in all those years, this was the first time in her life she could answer no to that question about a man. She said, no. Her father looked at her for a little longer. Then he said, then be careful, but don't be afraid. He said those two parts together, without separating them, the way he always said anything important, and Adeline understood that he was giving her an entire way to live, not merely a piece of advice. The wedding took place on a Wednesday afternoon near the end of January. 40 people were there, and Adeline didn't know a single one of them except Hollis Duke, who nodded to her from the end of a row of chairs in exactly the same way he always nodded to her in the third-floor hallway. She wore a dress someone else had chosen, stood in a room someone else had chosen, and listened to congratulations, spoken with exactly the kind of warmth people used when they'd already made up their minds about someone and were merely waiting for time to prove them right. The women there kissed her cheek. They complimented the dress. Not one of them asked where she'd grown up. Adeline smiled, said thank you, finished everything on her plate, and thought about the long game, the only kind of game her father had ever believed was worth playing. What she didn't know, what no one knew except a very small group of men, was that before that same night was over, in a room across the city, people had already begun discussing the most efficient way to remove her from the equation, not because of anything she'd done, because of everything she hadn't done yet. To them, a secretary with no assets, no relatives, and no one standing behind her was the easiest problem they'd ever been given. None of them had ever met her father. On the first morning in the house in Rittenhouse, Adeline woke at 6:40 because her body had been waking at that hour for 730 days and didn't know it had been given permission to stop. Emmett had left early. She went downstairs to the kitchen, made her own coffee in a kitchen where she still didn't know which drawer held what, ate a slice of toast standing beside the counter. And while she was standing there, the back door opened and a woman walked in without knocking. Bernadette Halloran was 46 years old, impeccably dressed at 9 o'clock in the morning, in the way of someone who had never once left her bedroom without being impeccably dressed, and she crossed the threshold with the ease of a person who had been using this kitchen longer than its new mistress had been alive. She stopped in the middle of the room, looked at Adeline standing there with the slice of toast in her hand, and said, "Oh, you're awake, Annalise." Then she set her handbag on the kitchen island and said, "Adeline," and continued toward the coffee maker as though what had just happened were a comma rather than a slap. She didn't apologize. She said Emmett had asked her to stop by, that she handled the family's domestic arrangements, and that it would take some time to bring Adeline into the proper routine. Adeline asked what routine. Bernadette turned and looked directly at her for the first time. A quick and complete look, the kind given by someone filing something into a drawer that had already been labeled. She said there were expectations, how to dress, which events required attendance, what could be said, and to whom. Then she paused for half a beat and added, "And what couldn't be said." Adeline took a bite of toast. She said, "I was your husband's secretary for 2 years. I know how to be silent in a room." Bernadette smiled. It was a perfectly precise smile, completely controlled, and it had nothing at all to do with her eyes. She said being Emmett Rourke's secretary and being Emmett Rourke's wife were two very different positions, picked up her handbag, announced that there would be dinner at her house on Wednesday evening, and that someone would come to help Adeline prepare her clothes, then walked out through the same door she'd entered. The door closed behind her with a very soft, very expensive click. Adeline finished her toast, washed the plate, and thought with absolute clarity that this was going to be a problem. On Wednesday evening, 16 people sat down to dinner at the Halloran house in Society Hill. No one announced anything, but the men sat at one end and the women at the other, following the natural choreography of a ritual that had been performed over and over for years. Adeline sat between Bernadette and a woman named Loretta Sabatini. The person across from her asked where she was from, and she said Montana. And the woman said, "Oh," in the tone of a door being very politely closed. Then she asked about family. Adeline said, "My father is here in Philadelphia. He used to serve on a mountain rescue team." The sentence fell into a brief silence that told her something about this table, that there was no category here for someone like her father. "No one else?" Bernadette asked from her left without looking up from her plate. "No one else." The meal continued. By dessert, The conversation had shifted to the annual fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, and Bernadette turned toward Adeline with the bright expression of someone preparing to be kind in a way that wasn't kind at all, and said that they would need to consider Adeline's role in the event carefully, because occasions like that required a certain kind of presence, and people would be curious about Emmett's choice. She paused for exactly 1 beat, timed down to the fraction of a second. We only want to make sure the impression left behind is the right one. The table didn't fall silent. It only tilted slightly, the way rooms do when everyone is pretending not to hear. Adeline set down her fork. She said, "My background is that I used to work for a living. I'm not ashamed of that." Bernadette said, "Of course not," smooth as water, and added that it was actually quite admirable, that Emmett had always been difficult to predict. Adeline looked directly at her and said in a perfectly ordinary voice, "You can rest easy. My footing is solid. Thank you for your concern." On the drive home, she said nothing for 15 minutes. Emmett read it on her face with the same accuracy that had always made her slightly uncomfortable, and he asked how the evening had gone. She said, "Mrs. Halloran is going to be a problem." He said, "I know." She asked if he'd known that before tonight. He said Bernadette was always a problem, that she was also extraordinarily useful, and that she'd been with the family longer than most of the people who worked directly for him. He said she wasn't dangerous. She was only protecting her territory. Adeline said, "That's a distinction I'll care more about when she stops making me feel like a mistake in your own living room." Something passed across his face. He said, "I'll speak to her." "Don't," she said immediately. He raised one eyebrow. She said, "If you speak to her, I become someone who needs protecting. I'll handle it myself." He looked at her for a long moment, with that measuring look of his. Then he said, "All right," and he kept his word. In the weeks that followed, Adeline did with the women of that world exactly what she had once done with clients' dietary restriction lists, which was to observe carefully, remember everything, and find the structure beneath the surface. What she found wasn't entirely what she'd expected. There was coldness. There were closed circles maintained through deliberate effort rather than simple indifference. And Bernadette Halloran stood at the center of all of them. But there was also Loretta Sabatini. Loretta was 43 years old, had married into this world when she was 22, and before that she'd grown up in a working-class neighborhood in East Baltimore where her father drove a truck hauling stone. The second time the two women sat beside each other, Loretta told Adeline, without any preamble at all, that Bernadette didn't hate her. Adeline said, "I know." Loretta turned and looked at her with an expression that suggested she was reassessing her. She said most women who came into this world thought Bernadette hated them. "She's protecting something. That's different from hate." Adeline asked what she thought Bernadette was protecting. Loretta was silent for a moment, then answered in 4 sentences, no longer than necessary, adding nothing and leaving nothing out. She said Emmett's first wife was named Rosalind, that she'd been born into this world, and that her father was a name that carried weight. She died 3 years ago. Bernadette had been as close to her as a sister, and from the day of the funeral until now, Bernadette had kept that seat empty in her mind. Adeline took that information and put it away. She said, "Thank you. That's worth knowing." Loretta said most people didn't ask. Adeline said most people didn't want complicated answers. Loretta almost smiled and said, "No, they don't." It wasn't exactly a friendship, but it was a place of her own in that social terrain, one that hadn't been built through Emmett's power or Bernadette's permission. It belonged to her, small and real, and she kept it the way she kept everything that was hers. That weekend, Adeline returned to the building by the harbor to collect the rest of her personal belongings from her old desk. She reached the 3rd floor at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, when the only other person on the entire floor was someone answering phones at the far end of the hallway. Someone new was already sitting at the desk. A young woman 5 or 6 years younger than Adeline, and the right-hand drawer, the one with the lock, had already been opened for her so she could remove her things. Adeline pulled it out and stopped. Nothing inside was missing. The scissors were still there. The box of staples was still there. The portable charger was still there. Even the 4 ink pens she'd set aside were still there, but they were in the wrong places. She always kept the scissors lengthwise along the inner edge, the points facing inward, because she'd opened that drawer roughly 4,000 times, and she didn't want there ever to be a day when the blades pointed outward. Now they were lying sideways. The box of staples that should have been in the back left corner was sitting in the middle. The 4 ink pens that should have been parallel had one turned the opposite direction. Nothing had been taken. It was simply that the entire drawer had been lifted through, examined, then put back by the hands of someone who didn't know what the original order had been. Adeline stood there and felt the back of her neck do the thing her father had taught her to notice rather than suppress. Your body knows things your mind is still catching up to, he'd once told her. Don't apologize for it. Just listen. She listened, and while she listened, she realized the second thing. The thing that mattered far more. The notebook wasn't there, not because she'd hidden it, not because she'd suspected anyone, but because for 2 years, on the final day of every month, she had closed the notebook she was using, put it into her bag, carried it home, and placed it in the bottom drawer of her cabinet with all the ones that came before it, then started a new one the following day. She had done exactly that at the end of the month, 10 days before the wedding, just as she'd done 24 times before. Whoever had opened this drawer had left empty-handed. Adeline closed it. She put the few remaining belongings into her bag, thanked the young woman sitting at the desk, and rode the elevator down with a calmness that surprised even her. All the way home, she went over everything the same way she checked weights against bills of lading. No one searched the drawer of a secretary who'd already left her job because they were looking for scissors and staples. They searched it because they believed something was inside. And the only person in that building who had ever asked her about the notebook, the only person who had ever heard her read aloud the 3 dates and times written in it, was the man she'd just married. But he wouldn't have needed to search the drawer. He only needed to ask, which meant there was a second person who knew the notebook existed. Adeline arrived home, went straight upstairs, opened the bottom drawer of the cabinet, and looked at the 25 leather-bound notebooks stacked in exact chronological order. She stood there looking at them for quite a long time. Then she closed the drawer, and she didn't tell anyone. Bernadette Halloran looked at her for another second and a half. Then she picked up the folder, tapped the edges lightly against the tabletop to straighten the papers, slipped it into her bag, and left through the same back door she'd entered. That soft, expensive click sounded once again. Adeline stood still and listened until the sound of Bernadette's heels had gone all the way down the gravel path beside the house, before turning back toward the kitchen counter. She poured herself a cup of coffee. She looked down at her hand as she poured, not because she was worried, but because she wanted to know. Her hand was perfectly steady. She carried the coffee to the table, sat down in the chair she hadn't gotten the chance to sit in at 9 o'clock, and gave herself 3 minutes. 3 minutes to understand clearly that what had just happened hadn't been an unpleasant conversation between 2 women in a kitchen. A person didn't bring a legal document to someone else's house on a Saturday morning unless they'd already calculated that the other person was going to sign it. And no one made that calculation unless they'd already finished assessing the other person's capacity to resist. Someone had measured her. Someone had measured her and concluded that she would sign. Then she thought about a drawer with 4 ink pens turned the wrong way, and she placed those 2 things side by side on the tabletop inside her mind, the way she would place 2 bills of lading with the same container number but different weights. She called Emmett. He answered on the second ring. She said, "Mrs. Halloran just came by." There was a very brief silence on the other end. He said, "I heard." She asked, "Did you ask her to bring me a document to sign?" The silence this time was shorter. He said, "No." The word dropped into her chest and hardened into something with a clear shape. She said, "All right." Then she continued, and her voice stayed at exactly the same temperature it had held from the beginning of the call. No louder, no colder, but beneath it there was something that hadn't been there before. She said, "I need you to understand something. I didn't get married so I could sign away my place the first time someone found me inconvenient. If that's what this marriage requires, you need to tell me right now." Emmett said, "That isn't what this marriage requires." His voice was flat and certain. He said, "Let me deal with Bernadette." She was about to say what she'd said in the car Wednesday night, that he shouldn't, that she would handle it herself, but he spoke first. He said, "This time is different. This isn't her protecting her territory. This time she's acting on someone else's instructions, which means the problem isn't her." The silence after that sentence had a completely different quality from every silence that had come before it. She asked, "Then who is it?" He said, "I'm not sure yet." Then he said, "Stay in the house today." She said, "Emmett." He said, "Please." And that was a word she hadn't heard him use as a reflex once in the 4 months she'd known him, and hearing it now told her the temperature of the things he knew and hadn't yet said. She stayed in the house. She tried to read and couldn't absorb a single word. She helped the housekeeper reorganize the pantry because she needed something to do with her hands, and she'd always thought more clearly when her hands were busy. By afternoon, she had a headache sitting directly behind both eyes, like something pressing outward from inside her skull. Emmett came home at 9 o'clock that night. He took off his coat, laid it over the back of a chair, and told her right there in the kitchen doorway, very quietly, that the document had been Desmond Halloran's idea. Adeline sat down. Desmond, Bernadette's husband. The man who had stood at Emmett's right hand for 21 years. She asked why. He said, "Because someone is paying him to make you look like a liability before they move against me." His voice remained controlled in exactly the way it always did, when he was dealing with something that wasn't under his control at all. He said Desmond had been in contact with Ward Corrigan's people for at least 8 months. Adeline said, 8 months. He said, 8 months. She did the calculation in her head and said, "So before the wedding?" He said, "Before I even asked you to marry me." The pain behind her eyes sharpened another degree. She asked, "Does Mrs. Halloran know?" He said, "Probably not everything. Desmond is very careful." She said, "She still brought that document into my kitchen." He said, "She thinks she's doing the right thing for this family. She thinks she's protecting me, my money, the things I've built." He stopped. She doesn't know that what she's actually protecting is Corrigan's plan. Adeline looked at her 2 hands resting on the tabletop, and inside her mind, very calmly, very clearly, she heard her father's voice saying what he'd told her when she was 16, that when someone tried to make your place smaller, they were preparing for something else, and the shrinking always came first. Emmett poured her a cup of tea she hadn't asked for, something he did whenever he needed to keep his hands busy so he could hold his own worries still in one place. Then he said there was an annual gathering at the house in the Pocono Mountains the following weekend, with the senior families, and he intended to cancel. Adeline set the teacup down before it reached her lips. She said, "Don't." He looked at her. She said, "The place is isolated. I know, but if you cancel this particular week, Corrigan will understand why you canceled. He'll know that you know, and when someone realizes his opponent knows, he doesn't pull back, he moves faster." She said it in exactly the same voice she'd once used to tell him that the schedule hadn't been arranged incorrectly. It had been arranged to force him to cancel one of his meetings. Then she said the rest. And that part didn't come from her. Retreat is a signal of weakness. Weakness invites people to move against you. If you have to stand out in the open, then stand there on your own terms. Emmett was silent for a while. He said, "I need you to keep appearing, to keep showing up everywhere you've been showing up, while I follow the money. If you disappear from the social calendar now, that's a signal too." She asked, "You're asking me to do the thing that makes them believe nothing has changed?" He said, "Yes. While you find where the money is going." "Yes." Adeline breathed in, breathed out, and thought about the dinner at the Halloran house, about the table tilting slightly to listen, about the smile timed down to the fraction of a second, and about how she'd sat quietly through that entire meal while people handled her as if a plan had already been built around her like a frame around a photograph. She said, "All right." Then he did something he very rarely did. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her instead of standing, and he said, "I need to know that you understand what I'm asking you to do." She said, "You're asking me to stay out in the open while you work." He said, "I'm asking you to trust me enough to remain exposed, while every instinct you have is telling you to find somewhere safe." Adeline looked at him and said, "My instincts have never told me to go looking for safety. My father didn't raise me that way." The road to the mountain house was about 3 miles long. The car left the state road, passed through an electric gate running on steel tracks, and beyond the gate the pine forest pressed in so closely on both sides that the headlights reached little farther than the shoulders of the road. Adeline watched the gate close in the rearview mirror and felt her chest tighten slightly, something she didn't call fear because it wasn't fear. It was the body's vigilance, and her father had taught her to recognize it and use it rather than suppress it. The house was built of stone and timber, set against the hillside, with enough rooms for 20 people to sleep, and the nearest neighbor was a 40-minute drive away on dirt roads. The families arrived gradually throughout Friday afternoon and evening. Desmond Halloran arrived at 7 o'clock with his wife, shook Emmett's hand in the foyer, kissed Adeline on the cheek, and said, "The air up here suits you," with the ease of a man who had performed ease for so long that it had become his resting state. Adeline smiled and said, "Thank you." Bernadette followed behind her husband, caught Adeline's eyes for one very brief moment, and there was something in that look that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite a warning, but something more complicated than either. Adeline noted it. She moved on. On Saturday morning, the meeting began at 9 o'clock in the large room at the back of the house, and she wasn't present. Something she neither objected to nor found surprising, because there were rooms she wasn't yet allowed into, and she understood that. She used those hours to do exactly what she always did whenever she had free time in a place she didn't know well. When you walk into an unfamiliar place, you learn it, her father had once told her over a topographic map spread across their dining table. in the patient voice of a man who understood that some lessons had to be taught 10 times before they became instinct. Not because something is happening, because something might happen. And when it does, you won't have time to learn anymore. So she learned. She walked every hallway. She found the service door behind the kitchen, the one that opened directly onto the stone steps leading down to the lawn. She counted the service staircase hidden inside the wall from the second floor down to the kitchen level. 14 steps, no more and no less, and counted them again on the way back up. She memorized the location of the kitchen electrical panel, mounted on the wall to the left, just behind the utility room door. She opened the cold room door and saw that it had an exterior latch, a horizontal steel latch that someone inside couldn't reach. And when she stepped onto the stone terrace at the back to walk around the house in the cold afternoon air, she felt a thin layer of ice beneath the soles of her shoes. She remembered that too. At 4:15 that afternoon, Emmett appeared in the kitchen doorway where Adeline was sitting with a cup of coffee, helping the housekeeper pick through vegetables, because her hands needed to stay busy, and her mind needed room to work. He asked the woman to give them a minute. She wiped her hands and left with the unhurried dignity of someone who had been stepping out of rooms like this for 14 years. Emmett sat down across from Adeline. He said Bishop Kane had managed to trace the financial thread. Adeline set down her coffee. He said money had been flowing into Desmond's accounts for 16 months. Not one payment, not two, but a steady stream, broken into smaller amounts and spread out carefully enough that none of it triggered any reporting threshold. She asked, "From Corrigan?" He said Kane hadn't been able to establish where the money originated. That was the problem. There was money going in, money going out. But between the two sat a layer of concealment, and that layer was an intermediary no one had been able to identify. He said Kane could prove Desmond was receiving money. Kane couldn't prove Corrigan was paying it. And unless they could connect those two ends, all they had was a man becoming unusually wealthy, not a conspiracy. Adeline understood immediately what that meant. It meant that as long as the name in the middle remained hidden, Emmett couldn't move against anyone. And as long as Emmett couldn't move, everything would keep running. Then he told her the second part, and he said it more slowly than the first. He said Kane had also reconstructed the entire Gareth Poole situation. Poole hadn't been the first traitor. Poole had been bait. Adeline sat very still. He said Corrigan needed Poole to be exposed. The entire Meridian Bay operation had been designed so that at a certain point, someone would discover it. And the person meant to make that discovery was Desmond Halloran. Desmond would bring it to me. Desmond would be the man who saved the organization from a major embezzlement scheme. And from that position, from the position of a man who had just proven his loyalty through something no one could dispute, he would finally gain the one thing 21 years hadn't completely given him, the right not to be examined. He stopped. He said, "You don't hollow out an organization from the outside. You hollow it out from the place no one thinks they need to look." The kitchen was very quiet. Adeline could hear the wind moving through the pines beyond the window, and she could hear the beat of her own pulse in her throat. She said, "So that Tuesday afternoon, Emmett said Poole had been positioned to take that phone call somewhere. Another person could hear it. It didn't necessarily have to be you. Anyone would have worked. A cleaner, a delivery worker, a secretary, as long as someone heard it and repeated it, so that it reached Desmond naturally, giving him a reason to investigate, and a reason to bring it to me." He looked at her. Kane reconstructed the schedule. "Desmond had an appointment with me the following Monday." Adeline did the calculation, and when she finished, something very cold moved down her spine. She said, "I knocked on your door Tuesday night," he said. 6 days before he was supposed to. She sat with that number. 6 days. She remembered the 3 hours with the cold coffee. She remembered how close she'd come to never standing up. She remembered that if she'd chosen silence that night, the way she'd chosen silence all her life, then the following Monday, Desmond Halloran would have walked into the room with the windows overlooking the harbor and become the hero. And no one in that building would have doubted him for another day. She had stolen that moment from him. She had stolen it with 11 steps and 2 knocks on a door, without having any idea what she was taking. She said it aloud, slowly. "He's hated me from the first day." Emmett said, "Yes, not because of who you are, because you stepped into the exact place he needed to stand." Adeline looked at her hands on the tabletop. She thought about the 3-page document, about the drawer with the 4 ink pens turned the wrong way, about the way Desmond had kissed her cheek in the foyer the night before, and told her the air up here suited her. Then she asked the question she'd been carrying inside herself from the moment Emmett began speaking. She asked it in a very careful, very controlled voice. She said, "So when you married me, was any part of that because of—" "No," he said. He said it immediately. without waiting for her to finish the sentence. And that immediacy was the most honest thing she'd ever received from him. He said, "I married you because of who you are, not because of their plan." He held her gaze. "I need you to understand the difference between those two things." Adeline looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I do." He let out a very small breath, almost invisible, but she saw it. She asked, "What do you do now?" He said, "Tonight I let Desmond believe today's meeting went exactly as usual." He said, "Tomorrow morning I remove him from this structure." Then his jaw tightened and he said, 21 years. Adeline understood what that meant. Not the procedural part, but the other part. The part made of 21 years of shared meals and shared decisions, and of discovering that his trust had been exploited from a direction he'd never once thought he needed to examine. She said, "I'm sorry." He looked at her as though the words surprised him. He said, "Don't be. It's..." Then he stopped and began again. "It's information. I deal with information." Adeline said, "You can still deal with it, and still be sorry that it's true." Emmett was silent for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Yes, I can." Friday dinner at the Mountain House was a performance, and Adeline performed it with everything she had, which was not a small amount. She asked Bernadette about the Children's Hospital fundraiser with genuine attention. She listened to Loretta talk about her daughter applying to college and asked the questions of someone who truly cared about the answers. She watched Desmond Halloran across the table tell a fishing story that made everyone laugh, and she laughed in the right places, while inside her mind there were 16 months, an unnamed layer of concealment, and a door opening at exactly the right moment in a third-floor hallway. Her hands were perfectly still. Her face was exactly where it needed to be. 2 years of sitting outside a door had taught her that the most important skill in any room was the ability to be both present and invisible, to manage her inner state with such precision that nothing escaped unless she allowed it to. She went upstairs at 11 o'clock. Emmett stayed downstairs. At 11:30, there was a knock at the door. Adeline was still fully dressed. She opened it and found Bernadette Halloran standing in the hallway in a robe, without makeup, looking like an entirely different person from the woman who had sat at the dinner table 3 hours earlier. Smaller, more tired. The performance had been taken off for the night, and underneath it was a woman who hadn't slept properly in weeks. She asked, "May I come in?" Adeline stepped back. Bernadette entered, stood in the middle of the room, and looked down at the floor for a while as though choosing words from a very limited supply. Then she said, 21 years. She said, "I knew he maneuvered things. He always maneuvered things. That's what he does. That's what he's done from the first day I knew him. And for 21 years, it was always on this side of the line." Her voice broke slightly on the words 21, and she pulled it back under control with an effort Adeline could see. Adeline said nothing. Bernadette said, "I thought that document was his way of protecting the family. I didn't know he was protecting an exit." She looked up. She said, "I know enough now." She didn't say who had told her, and Adeline didn't ask. Then Bernadette said the sentence both women in that room knew was the real one. She said, "You're not Rosalind." Adeline said, "No." Bernadette said Rosalind had been born into this world, understood every piece of it, had been shaped for it since before she could read. Then she said, "I watched you through dinner tonight, and I couldn't find a single moment when you let anything show. Not one moment. I've known women who were prepared for this their entire lives, and couldn't do what you did." Adeline still said nothing. Bernadette stood there for a while longer. She didn't apologize. She didn't say she regretted it. Didn't say she hoped Adeline would forgive her. Didn't say any of the things that made people feel better in the moment, and worse afterward. She only said, "I was wrong about you. I don't know what to do with that yet." Then she turned to leave, and at the doorway she stopped with one hand resting on the frame, and Adeline could see clearly that there was one more sentence caught in the woman's throat. Bernadette stood that way for about 3 seconds. Then she closed the door behind her and left. Downstairs, in the small room at the end of the east hallway, Desmond Halloran stood with his back to the door and a phone pressed to his ear. He said, "No, she isn't the problem." He listened for a while, then said it again, more slowly this time. "The notebook is the problem," he said. "She writes everything down by hand. 2 years. Every person who came up to the 3rd floor. Every time. Everyone they came with. All of it in ink. In notebooks she took home at the end of every month." He listened again, then interrupted. He said, "You don't understand. Without her, they're just pages of scribbling. No one can reliably read someone else's handwriting. No one knows what that slash mark means. And most importantly, no one can testify that any entry was actually written on the date written beside it." He listened through a long silence. Then he said, I gave you the layout and the procedures. I gave you everything you needed. The rest is your job." Then he hung up. Upstairs on the second floor, Adeline was repacking her suitcase for the next day. She folded her clothes, placed her shoes in the lower compartment, and left a sweater ready on the chair because mornings in the mountains were cold. She thought about Bernadette standing in the doorway with a sentence caught in her throat. She thought about 21 years. She zipped the suitcase closed and went to sleep without setting an alarm, because she'd never needed one. Emmett Rourke's phone vibrated at 2:40 in the morning. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman who identified herself as the night nurse on the respiratory unit and said that the condition of the patient in room 409 had suddenly deteriorated, that they needed to move him to a more intensive intervention, and that because Emmett was the guarantor for the full cost of treatment, they needed his signature before they could proceed. Emmett sat up in the darkness and looked at the woman sleeping beside him. He had 3 seconds to decide. If he woke her, she would make the entire 4-hour drive with that news sitting inside her chest, and if they arrived only to discover that it was an administrative procedure someone had made sound worse than it was, then he would have forced her to live through those 4 hours for nothing. If he went first and verified it himself, he would know for certain within 4 hours, and if it was real, he would come back for her immediately. He chose the second option. He dressed in the dark, left a message on her phone, went downstairs, and drove out onto the access road. It was the kindest decision he made that entire week, and it was the decision someone had calculated he would make. Adeline woke at 2:51. She didn't wake because of a sound. She woke because of the absence of one. For more than 30 hours inside this house, there had been a faint hum beneath everything else, the sound of the security system and equipment standing by, a sound her ears had registered, even though her mind had never consciously noticed it. Now it was gone. She opened her eyes in the darkness and lay perfectly still for exactly 2 seconds, to make sure she wasn't imagining it. Then she got out of bed, and instead of crossing through the middle of the room, she pressed herself against the wall beside the door. "Power going out can be weather," her father had once told her. "Power going out in a house with a backup generator is someone's choice." Her phone was on the nightstand. She reached it in 3 short steps, and looked down at the screen. No signal. Not weak signal. Not 1 bar. Nothing at all. In a place where the previous afternoon she'd been able to call the hospital from this very room. She stood in the darkness with the dead phone in her hand, and thought very quickly and very clearly, and the first thought that came to her was 3 simple words. Someone is blocking the signal. She opened the bedroom door. The hallway was completely dark, and a current of cold air was moving in a direction it shouldn't have been moving, which meant that somewhere downstairs, a door or a window was open. She moved along the hallway toward Emmett's room at the end of the west wing, walking from memory, because she'd walked the entire corridor twice the afternoon before, once in each direction, and she knew where the picture frames were, where the small table stood, where the runner rug ended 2 steps before the stairs. His room was empty. The blankets had been thrown aside. His shoes were gone from where he'd left them. She placed a hand on the pillow and found it still warm. He hadn't been gone long. She crossed to the window. Through the glass below, she could see the front grounds, the dim shapes of several parked cars, the black line of the pine trees, and something else. 2 red taillights were shrinking along the access road, disappearing between the rows of trees until they were gone. Adeline stood at the window for exactly 3 seconds. 3 complete seconds, and she used them to make the calculation. Emmett was gone. Someone had cut the power and blocked the signal. The access road was the only way out, and a car had just gone down it. Then she heard the first footstep on the main staircase. Not the housekeeper. The housekeeper slept in the east room and moved with the gait of an older woman who knew every inch of the house, steady and unhidden. This was something else. This was someone who knew exactly where the stairs were, who had walked straight to them in the darkness without feeling his way, but who stepped on the 3rd stair from the bottom. The 3rd stair creaked. Adeline knew that because she'd gone up and down that staircase 4 times the afternoon before. This man didn't. A floor plan could tell someone where the stairs were. A floor plan couldn't tell them which stair creaked. She tilted her head and listened, separating every other sound the way her father had taught her to listen in the woods. 1 person on the staircase, coming up, slow and steady, his weight pitched forward instead of landing through his heels. Then 2 more. Ground floor, another part of the house, moving toward the kitchen, which meant toward the service door that opened onto the stone steps at the back. 3 men, 2 directions. Adeline turned back into her room and did the first thing, the thing she'd already decided within the span of a single breath. She went to the window, unlatched it, and pushed it up exactly the width of 1 finger. No more. A window thrown wide open was a declaration, but a window left open just a crack was a question. and people always spent more time on questions than they did on declarations. She left it that way and stepped into the hallway. Then she turned left. The main staircase was to the right, and to the right was where the man was coming up. So she went in the opposite direction, toward the north end of the corridor, to the linen closet she'd opened the previous afternoon, and found filled with shelves of folded sheets and blankets in the darkness. She went inside, pulled the door closed, but didn't shut it all the way. Didn't let the latch click, only rested it against the frame. At the very back was a second door leading into the service staircase, hidden inside the wall, and running straight down to the kitchen level. She stood between two shelving units, breathing through her mouth, and listened as footsteps moved past in the hallway, stopped outside her bedroom door, and remained there long enough for her to count 12 beats of her own heart. Then a very quiet voice said, "West wing clear, room empty, window open." A reply came from downstairs, too faint for her to make out the words, but clear enough for her to know it was a different voice, clipped and professional, the voice of someone coordinating rather than improvising. Then a third voice rose from the direction of the kitchen through the very wall beside her, because the service stairwell carried sound through the length of the house like a pipe. The voice said, "She's not in the kitchen. Start sweeping." Adeline opened the inner door and began down. 14 steps. She counted them in the darkness with the soles of her feet, one hand sliding along the cold stone wall, and at the 6th step, she stopped, because someone had just entered the kitchen through the main doorway. She pressed herself against the wall and waited while the footsteps moved from near to far, toward the family dining room. Then she descended the remaining 8 steps. The door at the bottom opened behind the shelves where the dry goods were stored. She pushed it open about 3/4 of an inch, and looked through the gap, seeing the kitchen as a collection of dark shapes, and saw no one. She stepped out, crossed the kitchen from memory, found the handle of the service door, lowered the latch, and went outside. The air bit into her face. She stood on the stone step and did the second thing, the thing anyone watching would have thought insane. She took off her socks. The wool socks would be wet within 30 seconds, and wet wool against frozen ground made noise, a compressed sliding sound a person could hear from about 65 feet away. Bare feet didn't, and bare feet could do one more thing socks couldn't. They could read the ground, tell where the pine needles were thick enough to swallow a footstep, where the frost had frozen hard, where exposed roots would snap under her weight like dry kindling. The cold struck the soles of her feet like an impact. She breathed through it, controlled, and tucked the socks into the waistband of her pants. Then she left the stone step, crossed the lawn, and entered the woods. She didn't run. Running through an unfamiliar forest in the dark was the fastest way to break an ankle and end everything. She moved quickly, low and controlled, following the slope upward toward the rocky outcrop she'd noticed the previous afternoon while walking around the house. It took her less than 2 minutes to reach it, and she lay down behind the rocks and looked back toward the house below. 3 flashlight beams, one near the fence by the access road, one on the western slope, one moving slowly along the edge of the woods beneath her. They were spreading out, the proper search pattern for open terrain, and that was the first thing that told her these men were trained. The second came about 10 seconds later, and it was colder than anything running through her bare feet. They weren't shooting. She had stood in a dark hallway, crossed the kitchen, moved over an open lawn with her silhouette against the snow, and 3 trained men with weapons in their hands had had more than enough opportunity to end this during the past 6 minutes. They hadn't, which meant they weren't allowed to, which meant their orders weren't to end this, but to end it in a particular shape. A new wife unfamiliar with the house, the power failing in the middle of the night, panicking, running outside into the darkness, and never coming back. Nothing for an investigation to hold on to. No bullet wound for 4 families to explain to one another. Only a tragic accident in an isolated place, and a woman that entire world already believed couldn't take care of herself. Adeline lay behind the rocky outcrop and knew exactly what they were waiting for. She knew because her father had spent 22 years on a mountain rescue team and had sat with her telling stories other fathers didn't tell their daughters. He had told her what cold did to a human being, and the order in which it did those things. First came the shivering, which meant the body was still fighting. Then the shivering stopped, and that wasn't good news. Then came confusion, then bad decisions. Then the stage when a person no longer felt cold at all. He had made her stand barefoot in the snow when she was 15, until she could tell the difference between pain that warned of danger and pain that was only pain. The 3 men were spreading out to drive her farther and farther away from the house, and they needed to do only one thing. Wait, that was why she was still alive. And it was also why she decided to do the most dangerous thing of all the things she could have done that night. She looked down at the stone house, found the service door she'd just come through, and began calculating the route back. She came down the slope on a diagonal, keeping tree trunks between herself and the light near the access road, and reached the stone steps again in 3 minutes. The service door was still resting slightly open, exactly as she'd left it. Inside, the kitchen was empty. She crossed it and entered the utility room, and in the darkness, she found by touch the things she'd seen the previous afternoon. On the wall rack to the left was an ashwood axe handle, the blade long since removed, about 28 inches long and just heavy enough. On the lower shelf was a coil of bungee cord, and in the far corner, exactly where every mountain house seemed to keep one, was a gas lantern with a push-button igniter. She took all 3 and began. The first thing was the lantern. She carried it into the kitchen, turned the valve a quarter turn, bent her body over the igniter to shield it, and pressed the button. The first attempt didn't catch. The second produced a very soft pop, and a ring of yellow light opened around her. She placed the lantern on the counter, exactly where it could be seen through the window, facing the backyard, then stepped back into the utility room and pulled the door almost closed. The lantern said something very clearly to anyone looking at it from outside. It said she came back inside. She's looking for a source of light. She's panicking. She doesn't know what she's doing. It said, "Come in here." 50 seconds later, the service door opened. Adeline heard footsteps enter the kitchen, heard them stop at the counter, heard the man's breathing change as he picked up the lantern and turned it in his hand. He said quietly into his radio that there was a light on in the kitchen. She stepped out of the utility room. She didn't speak and she didn't hesitate, because her father had been very clear about this, that the time between decision and action was where people died, and you had to reduce that time to nothing. The axe handle came down once on the forearm holding the lantern. There was the sound of wood striking bone. The lantern flew in one direction, and the man dropped to one knee with a sound that never became a word. She struck a second time, lower, at the back of the knee on his supporting leg, and he went all the way down to the floor. She didn't strike a third time. She pulled his arms behind him, threaded the bungee cord around both wrists, and hooked it tightly to the leg of a metal rack bolted to the floor, something her father had once told her was absurdly underestimated as a restraint. She took the gun that had fallen from his hand, removed the magazine, and took the radio from his jacket pocket. The third thing took 4 seconds. She pressed the transmit button and said in a low, fast, broken voice, exactly the way someone sounded while moving, that she was on the east slope, heading uphill. A reply came back, clear and immediate. Copy. Then she heard running footsteps on the gravel outside, circling away in the opposite direction from the one she was about to take. The fourth thing was the breaker panel on the left wall, just behind the utility room door. She pulled down the breaker for the kitchen, then twisted the valve shut on the only lantern still burning on the floor, and the kitchen fell into darkness so complete that no shape seemed to exist inside it anymore. The third man entered through the main door 40 seconds later, stepping into a room he'd never walked through in his life, and that she had crossed 9 times in the past 24 hours. She heard him strike the corner of the kitchen island. She heard him curse under his breath and correct his direction. She stood behind the cold room door, which she'd left standing wide open, and when he began following the wall the way people always followed walls in darkness, he walked directly into that open space. She pushed the door shut. She dropped the horizontal steel latch into place. From inside came 2 blows against the door, then nothing, because the man was professional enough to understand immediately that pounding on it wasn't going to solve anything. The fifth thing had already been done before she came back inside. On the stone steps behind the house, where she'd felt the thin layer of ice beneath her feet the previous afternoon, she had stretched a length of bungee cord across at ankle height and secured it to the railing posts on either side. When the second man finished circling the east slope and came back looking for the service entrance, he stepped onto the stone steps at the speed of a man in a hurry on ice, and from inside the kitchen, she heard the sound of someone losing his footing completely and landing on his shoulder. She went outside, picked up his weapon, and removed the magazine. She gathered all 3 magazines and dropped them into the deep well in the middle of the backyard, listening to 3 very small splashes rise from far below. She didn't keep any of the guns. The only thing she carried with her was the radio. Before leaving, she went back into the kitchen and crouched beside the man tied to the metal rack. She asked who had hired them. He said he didn't know, his voice flat and professional, the voice of a man who had rehearsed that answer in his head a long time ago. He said, "I'm hired help. They don't tell me the structure." Adeline started to stand. Then he added one more sentence, something completely ordinary. "You should go before they wake up," and she froze exactly where she was. She knew that voice. Not from tonight. She had heard it on the third floor of the building by the harbor, at arm's length, in broad daylight. Over the past 10 months, 7 times, a man wearing the jacket of a courier company had stepped out of the elevator, placed an envelope on her desk, waited for her to sign the delivery sheet, thanked her, then left. 7 times, she had signed with her own hand. She had written the company name and the time in her notebook, exactly as she wrote down everything else, without once looking up long enough to study the face above that jacket. They had been watching her from right there at her own desk for almost a year. Adeline crouched lower. She said, "Give me the name of the person who gave you this job." He was silent. She said, "I signed for your deliveries 7 times. I remember your signature on the delivery sheet. If I walk out of here, I'll start remembering other things too." There was a long silence. Then he gave her a name, short and flat, the way someone handed over loose change to buy a little piece. He said, "Neil Bracken." The gate that ran along steel tracks had a manual release lever behind a panel on the left post, something Adeline had noticed when the car passed through it Friday night, because she noticed the entrances and exits of every place she entered, and that habit wasn't something she switched on only when she needed it. The lever was stiff from disuse. She pulled it a second time, harder, and the gate shifted just far enough for one person to squeeze through. Then she started walking. She didn't run. A little over 3 miles wasn't a distance to run, and now the greatest threat to her was no longer the 3 men in the house behind her, but the cold. And cold had to be managed because it couldn't be outrun. She walked down the center of the road, where the gravel was finest and the frost thinnest, avoiding the edges where the stones were larger and sharper. She breathed through her nose to keep as much warmth inside her body as possible. She counted her steps, because her father had taught her to measure distance by pacing when she was 12, and because counting gave the mind something to do when the body was somewhere it shouldn't be. At about half a mile, she heard a vehicle behind her and stepped into the trees. A dark sport utility vehicle passed at high speed without headlights, heading toward the state road. She stood behind a pine trunk and watched it disappear. Then she returned to the center of the road and kept walking. At roughly 1 mile and 7/8, the phone in her coat pocket suddenly vibrated several times, and when she looked down there were 2 bars of signal, along with a message sent at 2:47 that morning that had only now come through. She read it. The hospital called. "Your father's gotten worse. I'm going to verify it first. If it's real, I'll come back for you immediately." Adeline stood in the middle of the gravel road in the darkness and read the message a second time, and she understood the entire shape of the trap within the space of exactly 2 breaths. They hadn't lured him away with a threat. They had lured him away with his own kindness. At about 2.5 miles, headlights appeared from the direction of the state road, coming toward her very fast. She stopped in the middle of the road. The vehicle stopped about 65 feet away, its headlights shining directly into her face. A door opened. Footsteps sounded on the gravel. Then his voice called her name. Emmett Rourke stepped out of the light, and Adeline saw his face, white in the way a person's face went white after standing at the respiratory unit desk at 4 o'clock in the morning and being told that no one had called anyone, that the patient in room 409 was sleeping peacefully, that his readings had been stable all night. The first thing she said wasn't "save me." She said, "3 men. One is tied to the leg of a metal rack in the kitchen. One is locked inside the cold room, exterior latch. One is on the back steps after falling over a cord. All 3 guns have been unloaded. The magazines are at the bottom of the courtyard well, and there's a name, Neil Bracken." Then she added, "The man who's tied up is the same man who came to the office 7 times pretending to be a courier." Emmett looked down at her bare feet on the frozen gravel. Something moved through his jaw. He said, "Get in the car." Hollis Duke was driving, and he took a wool blanket from the trunk with the practiced ease of a man who kept a wool blanket in his trunk as a matter of professional principle. Adeline's feet were swollen red and completely numb, and when the heat from the vents began reaching them, the pain returned in waves, something she knew was a good sign. The doctor later called it first-degree frostbite and said 2 weeks, with no lasting damage. She wrapped the blanket around her feet and opened Emmett's computer on her lap. 40 minutes later, she had Neil Bracken. She didn't find him by typing his name and hoping. She did what her father had taught her to do with every problem that lacked enough information, which was to build the context around the answer until the answer became the only thing left. She began with Pennsylvania business registrations, then crossed over into Delaware. 4 limited liability companies, all formed within an 18-month period, all using the same registered address downtown, a mail receiving service that cost $40 a month and asked no questions. And there was the mistake. The kind of mistake people always made when they built a structure too quickly and weren't patient enough to be meticulous. The same representative appeared under two variations, one listed as N. Bracken, the other as Neil A. Bracken. Those two variations connected two branches that were never supposed to connect, and both branches touched a name Adeline had carried in her memory since that Tuesday afternoon, 2 years earlier. Meridian Bay Holdings. She said, "I found the layer in the middle." The next day, she sat at the kitchen table in the Rittenhouse house for 9 straight hours. She matched every payment, every date, every layer of ownership, and she followed even the branches that looked like dead ends, because thoroughness wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't fast, and it required a person to reach the absolute end of something before declaring it a dead end. 3 of those dead ends weren't dead ends at all. By 8 o'clock that evening, she had 51 pages, annotated, cross-referenced, arranged in an order that someone who knew nothing about finance could read from beginning to end. That night, beside the fireplace in the mountain house, Emmett sat across from Desmond Halloran with no table between them and no distance left at all. He said, 19 months. Desmond sat still for a very long time. Then he began to speak, and what came out was a story he'd told himself so many times that it had become indistinguishable from belief. He talked about the Pier 9 contract, about how he'd warned Emmett 4 times, about how Emmett hadn't listened. He said, "I was protecting what we built while you were distracted," and his eyes moved toward Adeline, very quickly, very briefly, completely beyond his control. Everyone in the room saw it. Emmett said, "You told Corrigan I was distracted, by my wife." Desmond said, "By the circumstances." Emmett said, "Say it correctly, Desmond." Desmond set down his glass, and his hand wasn't steady. He said, "I gave them the architectural plans and the security procedures. That's what I gave them. The agreement was financial separation, redistribution of the North Shore accounts, no violence." He looked up. "He didn't tell me he'd changed the terms," Emmett said. "He sent 3 men up here." Bernadette stood in the doorway with one hand pressed hard against her thigh, and Adeline watched the full weight of 19 months collapse onto that woman all at once. Desmond looked at Emmett one more time. His mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing left to say that the room didn't already know. Then he stood without waiting to be told, walked out toward the back of the house, and the only sound left behind was his shoes against the stone floor. The council of the 4 families was summoned at noon on Monday, and the summons carried a meaning everyone who received it understood, which was that anyone who refused to come had already answered the question for themselves. So Ward Corrigan came, 63 years old, exactly on time, coat draped over one arm, and he greeted every person at the table with precisely the amount of warmth an innocent man would use. Adeline entered behind Emmett wearing flat shoes because her feet still couldn't tolerate anything else, and she walked a little more slowly than usual, and she didn't try to hide it. She sat to her husband's right, placed the document packet face down in front of her, and folded both hands over it. Emmett began without an introduction. He laid out the events in order, using the emotionless language he always used for serious matters. And because there was no emotion in it, each fact landed on the table with more weight than any other tone could have given it. 3 armed men. The security system disabled. The signal blocked. A fraudulent call impersonating the hospital. The entire table went silent. Corrigan said that was an extremely serious accusation. Emmett said, "It isn't an accusation. It's a description of what happened." Corrigan asked whether he had proof. Adeline turned the 51 pages face up and pushed them into the center of the table. The oldest man there, head of the Western family, pulled the packet toward himself and began reading slowly. And when he turned to page 11, Corrigan started speaking. He said these were public business registrations. Anyone with internet access could download them. He said anyone could place 4 companies side by side and draw a story from them, and this was a story drawn by someone who needed a story. He said it very calmly, and he struck exactly at the weakest point in the file, and Adeline felt the table tilt. The head of the Western family looked up from the pages. The man beside him leaned back in his chair. No one said anything, but the weight in the room had shifted toward the far end of the table, and Adeline recognized it with the same precision she'd once recognized a dinner table tilting slightly to listen. She stood. She placed the second thing on the table. It was a leather-bound notebook worn at the corners, and beside it she laid 2 more. All 3 opened to pages dense with handwriting in different ink colors from month to month. Blue, then black, then blue again, in the exact order the pens had run dry over 2 years. She said, "This isn't financial evidence. This is the visitor log for Mr. Rourke's 3rd-floor office. I kept it by hand, 8 hours a day. For 2 years. Because the company's computer system lost an entire week's worth of data twice, without anyone ever explaining why. She opened a page she'd marked in advance. She said, "Over the past 19 months, Mr. Halloran left the office exactly 41 times during periods that didn't appear on the schedule I maintained. 41 times. I recorded when he went down and when he returned." She placed one finger on the 51-page packet in the center of the table. "Every one of those 41 absences matches, within 90 minutes, a transaction in the documents you're holding. There are no exceptions." No one spoke. The head of the Western family pulled one of the notebooks toward him and turned several pages, and Adeline saw on his face exactly what she needed to see, a man realizing that what he held in his hands couldn't have been manufactured overnight. Corrigan said anyone could write something down on paper. Adeline looked directly at him and gave the final answer. She said, "No one can fabricate 2 years of one person's handwriting, Mr. Corrigan. The ink changes color by month. The paper has aged over time. My writing shakes more on days when I was sick and sits straighter on days when I'd slept enough." Then she said the rest, and she didn't raise her voice at all. "And no one ever thought there would be a reason to fabricate it, because for 2 years, not one person in this room ever asked my name." The room became silent in an entirely different way. Corrigan still had one path of retreat, and he moved into it immediately, because that was what he'd been doing for 30 years. He said, "That notebook only proves Desmond Halloran left the office. It doesn't prove he met with me. It doesn't prove a single dollar came from me." The conference room door opened. Bernadette Halloran walked in. She didn't look at Corrigan. She went straight to the head of the table and set down 3 household expense ledgers. The hardbound, kind women of her generation still used to record every expenditure by hand, and she opened them to pages marked with slips of paper. She said, "These are my household expenses for the past 19 months. She said, "Every amount of cash that entered my home and that my husband couldn't explain, I recorded on the day I discovered it. Dates and amounts." Then she said, "Compare them." She stood straight with both hands resting on the back of a chair, and she spoke to the room rather than to any one person. She said, "I once brought her a piece of paper and told her to sign it. Today, I brought this." The head of the Western family compared the 3 columns of figures for about 4 minutes. When he looked up, he didn't look at Adeline, and he didn't look at Emmett. He looked at Ward Corrigan, and there was nothing managed in that look. The vote happened without debate. All 4 families cut Corrigan out of every shared agreement, froze every jointly held account, and informed all remaining parties that anyone who continued doing business with him would be considered to have chosen his side. He was escorted from the room. No sound was louder than chairs sliding across the floor. 72 hours later, Ward Corrigan's organization came apart, and it came apart in exactly the way things built on money always came apart, which was without much drama at all. It came apart through bills coming due and not being paid, through men checking their accounts on Thursday morning and seeing that the numbers hadn't moved, through calls being placed that no one answered, and through silence spreading slowly from the inside outward until there was nothing left to hold the shell upright. 3 weeks later, Weldon Vance was discharged from the hospital. He came to the house in Rittenhouse on a Saturday afternoon in a car Emmett had sent to pick him up, and he neither refused nor commented on it, because he wasn't the kind of man who turned down practical help, and he wasn't the kind of man who performed emotion about receiving it. He moved more slowly than before, one hand resting on the railing as he climbed the front steps, but his shoulders still carried the posture of a man who had once walked into places everyone else was running out of. Emmett came all the way to the door to meet him, something Adeline noticed and said nothing about. The 2 men looked at each other for about 3 seconds before shaking hands, and during those 3 seconds, each of them was doing exactly what the other was doing, measuring. "Mr. Vance," Emmett said. "Weldon," her father said. They had dinner. The 2 men talked for nearly 3 hours, and on the surface the conversation was about very practical things. The river, the neighborhood, the year the house had been built, and how many times it had been renovated. Beneath that surface was another conversation that didn't require words, the kind 2 men have when each is trying to decide whether the person sitting across from him deserves something important to him. Adeline finished her meal, listened, and let it happen. After dinner, she stood at the sink washing dishes, because she always did something with her hands when she needed to think, and her father came to stand beside her, and the 2 of them remained there in the silence that had always been the oldest language between them, a language that existed before words. Finally he said, "He's careful with you." She said, "Yes," he said. "Not the kind that shields you from everything, the kind that pays attention to you." She said, "Yes," again. He was quiet for another moment, then said, "Pocono," she said. "I did exactly what you taught me." Weldon Vance looked down into the sink, and he nodded once, and he didn't say anything more, and she understood that it was everything he could say without breaking, and she didn't need anything more. The following week, Adeline went to the children's wing of the hospital to arrange the transfer of a charitable fund she'd proposed, redirecting from the annual fundraiser into an activity program for young patients. When she walked into the common room, several children were sitting around a low table drawing pictures, and there was laughter, and one child was trying very seriously to convince another that an elephant could absolutely be purple if you wanted it to be purple. A little girl looked up at Adeline and asked if she was the lady who had brought the crayons. Adeline said yes. The girl said, "Then sit here." And Adeline sat down, and for the next 40 minutes she didn't think about ledgers, transactions, or any room where 4 families sat around a table. That February evening, at the annual fundraiser, Adeline wore an outfit she'd chosen herself, borrowed from no one and approved by no one. She stood beside a window overlooking the Delaware River as it froze beneath the winter night, the city lights stretching across the ice in long bands. The head of the Western family crossed the room to speak with her, and he walked directly to her rather than to her husband. He said, "My side would like to speak with you directly about our financial record-keeping and reconciliation procedures from now on." She said, "I'm available." He looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a man who only bothered to assess people honestly when he considered them worth assessing, then nodded and walked away. Emmett came to stand beside her a little while later. He said, "You don't have to take that on." She said, "I know." Then she said, "But I'm good at it." He looked out across the ice for a moment, then looked at her, and on his face was that rare openness she had learned to value, precisely because it was rare. He said, "Yes, you are. Some people go through their entire lives being looked through instead of being seen, not because they're small, but because the world has grown accustomed to measuring a person's worth by the title they carry and the clothes they wear, and anyone without those two things is assigned to the background of the room." Adeline Vance had never changed. She had always been the same person. From those mornings at 7:45 when she made coffee for a room she wasn't permitted to enter, to the afternoon when she placed her handwritten notebooks on a table in front of 4 families, the only thing that changed was that the world finally agreed to look, and the lesson that remained after everything that happened was simpler than people might imagine. Quiet preparation when no one is watching, kindness offered without demanding payment in return, and dignity kept intact in the very rooms that look down on you. Those are the things that make a person who they are. Their 2 glasses touched lightly once. They didn't raise a toast, because neither of them was that kind of person. And that was enough. It had always been enough. If Adeline's story touched something in you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day you can discover more stories worth hearing. How do you feel about her journey? And have you ever known someone in your own life who carried themselves with that same quiet strength? Leave a few words in the comments. We truly want to hear what you feel deep in your heart. We wish you and your family good health, joyful days, and lasting peace. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.